Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Before we get into tonight's game, I wanted to ask a question. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. Welcome to the definitive CEDH compilation of Winota, Joiner of Forces. Winota is an explosive stacks combo deck that wants to play non-human creatures as early as possible. Once on the battlefield, Winota cheats creatures into play at an alarming rate, overwhelming the board very quickly. The explosive nature of the deck in combination with its tightly layered combos makes Winota a real threat at the table. Mike wins the NyQuil flavor blind taste test and gets to start us off. But Noah has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Ponder. Mike draws a card for turn and plays a Plateau. He casts Esper Sentinel. He casts a Phyrexian Walker. Mike passes. Sean draws a card for turn and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Boseiju, who endures. Esper Sentinel triggers and Mike draws. Sean casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. Sean passes. Noah draws and plays a Training Center. He casts his commander, Krark the Thumbless. Noah ends his turn. Greg draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts Deathrite Shaman. He pays 2 life to cast Jataxian Probe, targeting Mike. Esper triggers and Mike draws. Greg looks at Mike's hand and draws a card. He casts a Mox Amber and gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Naganjo, Seed of the Empire. He casts Grand Abolisher. Mike ships the turn to Sean. Sean draws and casts Llanowar Elves. He passes. Noah draws and starts off his turn by casting Rite of Flame. Krark and Esper trigger. Mike draws a card, then Krark resolves. Noah wins the flip, copying Rite of Flame. Then Noah adds 4 red. He casts his other commander, Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. It enters as a copy of Krark. All through, Noah ends his turn. Greg draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Sig, River Cutthroat. Greg gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Goblin Crater Maker. Mike passes. Sean draws and casts a Mystic Remora. Esper triggers and Sean pays. Remora resolves and Sean ends his turn. Noah draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Noah's turn, Greg activates Deathrite Shaman, exiling Rite of Flame, with each opponent losing 2. Greg draws and plays an Underground Sea. He casts his commander, Vile Smasher the Fierce. Greg passes. Mike draws, looks at Remora, and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Sean pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws, does nothing else, and passes. Noah draws and casts a Talisman of Creativity. Esper and Remora trigger, and both draw. Noah ends his turn. At the end of Noah's turn, Greg activates Deathrite Shaman, exiling Jataxian Probe, with each opponent losing 2. Greg draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Keen Sense, targeting his Vile Smasher. Vile Smasher, Esper, and Remora all trigger. Sean draws, Greg pays for Esper, then rolls for Vile Smasher, dealing 1 to Sean. With Keen Sense still on the stack, Sean casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Vile Smasher. Esper triggers and Sean pays. In response, Greg casts Spell Pierce, targeting Chain. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Spell Pierce counters Chain of Vapor and Keen Sense resolves. Greg moves to combat and attacks Noah with Vile Smasher. Noah takes it and Keen Sense triggers. Greg draws a card and then passes the turn to Mike. At the end of Greg's turn, Mike flashes in an Aven Mind Sensor. Mike draws and plays a Plains. He casts Chrome Mox. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Chrome Mox resolves and Mike imprints Skyclave Apparition. He casts his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. He casts Gingerbrute. He moves to combat and attacks Greg with Mind Sensor, Phyrexian Walker, and Gingerbrute, and Noah with Goblin Crater Maker. Winota triggers 4 times. Mike looks at the top 6 and fails to find. He looks at the next 6 and then puts Ethersworn Canonist onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Greg. He looks at the next 6 and then puts Blade Historian onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Greg as well. He then looks at his final 6 and puts Recruiter of the Guard onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Greg. Recruiter triggers and Mike fetches up a Solitude into his hand. Greg blocks Gingerbrute with Sig, and then he and Noah take the rest. All through, Mike passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Sig triggers and Greg draws. During his upkeep, Sean pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts Wild Growth on his Command Tower. Esper triggers and Mike draws. All finished up, Sean passes, discarding to hand size. Noah draws and plays an Ottawara, Soaring City. He casts Archmage Emeritus. Noah attempts to move through phases, and in his second main phase, Greg activates Deathrite Shaman, exiling Forbidden Orchard, adding a red. He casts Flame Sweep. Vial Smasher, Esper, and Remora trigger. In response, Mike evokes Solitude, exiling a white card. It enters, exiles Vial Smasher, and Greg puts it into the command zone. Then Solitude is sacrificed. Then Sean and Mike draw a card, Greg rolls for Vial Smasher, and deals 3 to Noah. Then Flame Sweep resolves, dealing 2 to each creature. Mike then sighs as Noah passes the turn. At the end of Noah's turn, Sig triggers and Greg draws. Greg draws and plays a command tower. He casts Rashmi, Eternity's Crafter. In response, Sean casts Delay, countering and exiling Rashmi with 3 time counters on it. Next, Greg casts Mystic Remora. Sean's Remora triggers and he draws. Greg's Remora resolves and he passes the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Blinkmoth Nexus. He casts Sanctum Prelate. It enters and Mike names 2. He casts a Draneth Magistrate. He moves to combat and attacks Greg with Winota and Blade Historian and Noah with Phyrexian Walker. Winota triggers, Mike looks at the top 6 and fails to find. Then Greg takes it and Mike passes the turn. During his upkeep, Sean pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a Savannah. He casts Devoted Druid. Sean gives the turn to Noah. Noah draws and casts Frantic Search. Both Remoras trigger and Greg and Sean draw. Frantic Search resolves, Noah draws 2, discards 2, and untaps 3 lands. Noah casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Noah creates 7 treasures. Locked out by Draneth Magistrate, Noah passes to Greg. During his upkeep, Greg pays for his Remora. Also in his upkeep, he removes a time counter from Rashmi. He draws and plays a Watery Grave into play tapped. Greg passes. Mike draws and casts Shatterskull Smashing, where X equals 3, targeting Devoted Druid and Sig River Cutthroat. Both Remoras trigger and they both draw. Then Shatterskull resolves. Mike attempts to move to combat and, in response, Greg channels Ottawara, Soaring City, bouncing Blade Historian to Mike's hand. Then Mike attacks Greg with Winota, Phyrexian Walker, Sanctum Prelate, and Draneth Magistrate. Winota triggers, Mike looks at the top 6, putting Brutal Cathar onto the battlefield tapped and attacking Greg. Brutal Cathar triggers, exiling Sean's Thrasios, with Sean choosing to put it into the command zone. Then Greg takes the damage and Mike passes to Sean. During his upkeep, Sean pays to keep his Remora. He draws, holds open mana, and passes the turn, discarding to hand size. During Noah's upkeep, Day becomes Night and Brutal Cathar transforms into Moonrage Brute. Noah draws, takes no actions, and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Greg pays for his Mystic Remora. Also in his upkeep, he removes a time counter from Rashmi. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. Greg ends his turn. Mike draws and activates Blinkmoth, turning it into a creature. He moves to combat and attacks Greg with Winota and Sean with Blinkmoth, Phyrexian Walker, Moonrage Brute, Sanctum Prelate, and Draneth Magistrate. Winota triggers 3 times. Mike looks at the top 6 and puts Combat Celebrant onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Sean. He looks at the next 6 and fails to find. He then looks at the next 6 and puts Magus of the Moon onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Sean as well. Both declare no blocks, take it all, and Greg dies. In his second main phase, Mike casts Imperial Recruiter. It enters and Mike fetches up an Alseid of Life's Bounty into his hand. He casts Alseid of Life's Bounty. Finished up, Mike ends his turn. At the end of Mike's turn, Sean casts Force of Vigor, exiling a green card, targeting Alseid and Blinkmoth Nexus. In response, Mike exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He activates Alseid, sacrificing it and giving Blinkmoth protection from green until end of turn. Force of Vigor fizzles and Sean moves to his turn. During Sean's upkeep, Night becomes Day and Moonrage Brute transforms back into Brutal Cathar. It triggers and exiles Dockside Extortionist. Also during his upkeep, Sean lets his Remora die. He draws, takes no actions, and passes the turn. During Noah's upkeep, Day becomes Night and Brutal Cathar transforms into Moonrage Brute. Noah draws, sees the writing on the wall, and passes the turn. Mike draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts Blade Historian. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with Magus, Winota, Combat Celebrant, and Imperial Recruiter, and attacks Noah with Phyrexian Walker, Moonrage Brute, Draneth, and Prelate. When Mike attacks with Combat Celebrant, he exerts it, untapping his other creatures and gaining an extra combat step. Winota triggers twice, and knowing they are inevitably dead, Noah and Sean concede, and Mike wins the game. And Sean gets to start us off. Sean draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts an Elvish Mystic and passes the turn. Noah draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He passes. Greg draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He casts out Mana Crypt. He cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He casts a Bloom Tender and gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. Mike ends his turn. Sean draws and plays a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Sylvan Library. He passes. At the end of Sean's turn, Noah cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Vents into play tapped. Noah draws and plays a command tower. He casts Desperate Ritual, adding 3 red. He casts his commander, Krark the Thumbless. Noah casts Overmaster. Krark triggers, Noah wins the flip, copying Overmaster. Both resolve and Noah draws 2 cards. Finished up, Noah passes. During his upkeep, Greg loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Underground River. He taps his Underground River to help cast his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. Greg passes. Mike draws and plays a command tower. He moves to combat and attacks Greg with Winota. Greg takes it, and in his second main phase, Mike casts Drannith Magistrate. Mike ends his turn. During his draw step, Sean draws 2 extra from Sylvan Library, paying 8 life to keep them both. He plays a Forbidden Orchard for turn. He casts a Spellseeker. It enters, and Sean fetches up a March of Swirling Mists into his hand. The table suddenly worries, and Sean passes the turn. Noah draws and casts Gamble. Krark triggers, Noah loses the flip, bouncing Gamble back to his hand. He plays an island for turn. He pays 2 life to cast Jataxian Probe, targeting Sean. Krark triggers, Noah wins the flip, copying Probe, targeting Greg. He looks at Greg and Sean's hand and then draws 2 cards. Next, Noah casts Strike It Rich. Krark triggers, Noah loses the flip, bouncing it back to his hand. All finished up, Noah passes. At the end of Noah's turn, Greg activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Waterlogged Grove into play tapped. During his upkeep, Greg loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. Also in his upkeep, he casts Vampiric Tutor. In response, Noah casts Submerge for its alternate cost, targeting Bloomtender. Krark triggers, Noah wins the flip, copying Submerge, targeting Thrasios. It resolves, and Greg moves Thrasios to the command zone. Then the original resolves, and Greg puts Bloomtender onto the top of his library. Then Vampiric Tutor resolves, and Greg says goodbye to Bloomtender as he fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Greg draws and casts a Mana Vault. He taps his Waterlogged Grove and his Underground River to help cast Consecrated Sphinx. In response, Sean, not wanting to let that nonsense on the board, casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling Consecrated Sphinx. Dismayed his spicy creature didn't land, Greg passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Sacred Foundry onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with Drannith and Winota. Sean takes it, and in his second main phase, Mike casts Sanctum Prelate. It enters, and Mike names 1. Everyone else sighs, and Mike ends his turn. During his draw step, Sean draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 8 life to keep them both. He casts Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He taps Forbidden Orchard, giving Noah a spirit to cast Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Sean creates 2 treasures. He pays 2 life to help cast Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters as a copy of Dockside. It triggers, and Sean creates 2 more treasures. He casts Emil the Blessed. Everyone suddenly stands to attention, and Sean passes to Noah. Noah draws, stares at Sanctum Prelate, and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Greg loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. During his draw step, he takes a damage from his mana vault. Greg casts Toxic Deluge, paying 4 life. In response, Sean casts March of Swirling Mists, where X equals 3, exiling a blue card, phasing out his own Emil, Kinnan, and Dockside. Then Deluge resolves, and all creatures get -4/-4, wiping the board. All finished up, Greg passes. Mike draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Noah casts Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. Before Sean's turn, his creatures phase in. During his draw step, he draws 2 extra from Sylvan Library, paying 4 life to keep 1 extra. He plays an Emergence Zone. He activates Emil, targeting his Dockside. In response, Noah casts Stifle, targeting the activated ability of Emil. In response, Sean taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Noah a spirit, and casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Stifle. In response, hoping to find an answer, Greg sacrifices his Waterlogged Grove, drawing a card. He does not find it, and the stack resolves. Red Blast counters Stifle, and Emil flickers Dockside. Dockside enters, and Sean creates 2 treasures. Since Kinnan is on the battlefield, all of Sean's treasures add 2 mana, so he presents a loop of activating Emil, flickering Dockside, and generating more and more mana. He recasts his commander, Thrasios. He activates Thrasios, drawing his deck and putting all lands onto the battlefield tapped. He casts all of the creatures in his deck. He casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals 69,420, pumping his creatures and giving them haste. He moves to combat, attacks with the team, and Sean wins the game. Zach was able to hacky sack the longest and gets to start us off. But Rust has a pregame action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Ruby Medallion. Zane draws a card for turn and plays a command tower. He casts Birds of Paradise. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Mana Confluence. Zane passes the turn. Noah draws a card for turn and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a Soul Ring. He follows up with an Arcane Signet. He ends his turn. Rust draws and plays a Mountain. He casts his commander, Norin the Wary. Rust passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts Mox Diamond. Norin triggers and exiles. It enters and he discards a plains. Mike ends his turn. At the end of Mike's turn, Norn triggers. In response, Zane casts a Vampiric Tutor. In response, Noah casts Brainstorm. He draws 3 and then puts 2 back on top. Vampiric Tutor then resolves, and Zane fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Norn then enters the battlefield, and the turn moves to Zane. Zane draws and casts Hermit Druid. Norn triggers and exiles. Hermit Druid then resolves. Zane moves to his end step, and Norn enters the battlefield. And this is the point when we're just going to let everyone assume that this is what happens at the end of every turn. The turn moves to Noah. Noah draws and plays a Shivan Reef. He casts Ruby Medallion. Norn triggers and exiles. Noah then casts his commander, Krark the Thumbless. Noah passes. Russ draws and plays a mountain. He casts Sting Scourger. Norn triggers and exiles. Sting Scourger enters and bounces Hermit Druid back to Zane's hand. Russ moves to his end step and Norn triggers. In response, Mike casts a Braid, targeting Krark. Noah responds by casting Unsubstantiate, targeting a Braid. Krark triggers and Noah wins the flip. Before declaring targets, he makes a deal with Rust to use Sting Scourger to bounce Winota back to Mike's hand after he casts it. Rust agrees, and Noah bounces Sting Scourger back to Rust's hand. Then the original copy of Unsubstantiate bounces a Braid back to Mike's hand. Norn then enters the battlefield, and then turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and plays a City of Traitors. He casts Mogcatcher. Norn triggers and exiles. Mogcatcher resolves, and Mike gives the turn to Zane. Zane draws, assesses the board, and passes the turn. Noah draws and plays an island. He casts his other commander, Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. Norn triggers and exiles. It enters as a copy of Krark the Thumbless. Noah moves to combat and attacks Zane with Krark. Zane takes it, and Noah ends his turn. Russ draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a mountain onto the battlefield. He casts Impact Tremors. Norn triggers and exiles. The table grumbles, and Impact Tremors resolves. Rust casts a Grindstone. He passes, Norn enters, and each opponent takes 1 from Impact Tremors. The turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and casts a Serra Ascendant. Norn triggers and exiles. Mike moves to his end step and Norn triggers. In response, Zane casts Assassin's Trophy, targeting Sakashima. Noah responds by casting Muddle the Mixture, targeting Assassin's Trophy. Both Krark and Sakashima trigger. Noah loses his first flip, returning Muddle back to his hand. He then wins his second flip, creating a copy of Muddle the Mixture, targeting Assassin's Trophy. Assassin's Trophy is countered, Norn enters, deals 1 to each opponent, and the turn moves to Zane. Zane draws and starts off his turn by casting Dockside Extortionist. Norn triggers and exiles. Dockside enters, and Zane creates 6 treasures. He casts his commander, Yggdrasil, Maelstrom Wielder. He follows it up with a Hermit Druid. With the table on high alert, he passes, Norn enters, and deals 1 to each opponent. Noah draws and casts Solve the Equation. Norn triggers and exiles. Krark and Sakashima both trigger. He wins the first flip, creating a copy of Solve the Equation. Noah fetches up a Jeska's Will into his hand. He then loses the second flip and returns Solve the Equation to his hand. Noah then casts Jeska's Will, targeting Mike. Krark and Sakashima trigger, and in response, Mike activates Mogcatcher. He fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the battlefield. Dockside triggers and creates 7 treasures. With the triggers still on the stack, Mike casts a Braid, targeting Sakashima, killing it. Then Krark and Sakashima's trigger resolve. Noah loses the first flip, bouncing Jeska's Will back to his hand, and then he loses the second flip as well. Dismayed, Noah ends the turn, Norn enters, and then deals 1 to each opponent. Russ draws and plays a Great Furnace. He moves to combat and attacks Zane with Norn. Norn triggers and exiles. Russ then moves to his end step, and Norn triggers. In response, Mike casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Hermit Druid. Hermit Druid is exiled, and Zane gains 1 life. Then Norn enters and deals 1 damage to each opponent. Mike draws and starts off his turn by casting Kiki Jiki, Mirror Breaker. Norn triggers and exiles. The table then braces for impact as Kiki Jiki resolves. Mike activates Kiki Jiki, targeting his Dockside Extortionist. He creates a token of Dockside with haste and creates 6 treasures. Mike then casts Zealous Conscripts. It enters and targets Kiki Jiki, untapping it. Mike then presents a loop of activating Kiki Jiki to create a token copy of Zealous Conscripts. The token enters and untaps Kiki Jiki. He creates 69,420 copies of Zealous Conscripts for each of his opponents, and then attacks for the win. And Noah gets to start us off. Noah draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. He passes. Russ draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a mountain onto the battlefield. He casts a Skull Clamp. He ends his turn. Mike draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Gingerbrute. Mike moves to combat and attacks Zane with Gingerbrute. Zane takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Mike casts Phyrexian Walker. He gives the turn to Zane. Zane draws and starts off his turn by casting Lotus Petal. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Talisman of Curiosity. He plays an Overgrown Tomb into play untapped, paying 2 life. With a blazing fast start, he ends his turn. Noah draws and plays a Training Center. He passes. Russ draws and plays a Prismatic Vista. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a mountain onto the battlefield. He ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Goblin as it enters. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Goblin Rabblemaster. He moves to combat, Rabblemaster triggers, and creates a 1/1 Goblin with haste. He attacks Noah with his Goblin token and Gingerbrute. Noah takes it, and Mike ships his turn. During his upkeep, Zane loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a City of Brass. He taps his City of Brass and cracks his pedal to cast Necropotence. It resolves, and Zane pays 15 life, exiling 15 cards. Zane moves to his end step, and Necropotence triggers. In response, Noah cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. Zane then puts the exiled cards into his hand and discards to hand size, exiling the discarded cards. Noah draws and plays a Fiery Islet. He casts his commander, Krark the Thumbless. He ends the turn. Russ draws and plays a Great Furnace. He passes. Mike draws and moves to combat. Goblin Rabblemaster triggers and creates a 1/1 Goblin token with haste. He attacks Zane with everything. Goblin Rabblemaster triggers, getting +2/+0 until end of turn. Zane takes it, and in his second main phase, Mike plays an Inkmoth Nexus. He gives the turn to Zane. During his upkeep, Zane wins his Mana Crypt trigger. He skips his draw step due to Necropotence. He plays a Command Tower. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He follows it up with an Underworld Breach. In response, Noah casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost. Krark triggers, and Noah wins the flip, creating a copy of Fierce Guardianship targeting Underworld Breach as well. In response, Zane casts Manamorphose, adding a blue and a black mana to his pool and drawing a card. Zane then casts Tainted Pact. It resolves, and he exiles cards until he finds an Autumn's Veil, putting it into his hand. Zane taps his Talisman to cast Autumn's Veil. It resolves, and both copies of Fierce Guardianship fizzle. Then Underworld Breach resolves. Zane escapes Lotus Petal from his graveyard. In response, Russ casts Chaos Warp, targeting Underworld Breach. Chaos Warp resolves, Zane shuffles Underworld Breach into his library, and then he reveals a Dockside Extortionist off of the top of his library, putting it onto the battlefield. Everyone erupts, and Dockside creates 4 treasures. Zane then casts a Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Underworld Breach. He taps his City of Brass to cast Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting himself. Zane mills 33 cards. He activates Necropotence 4 times, paying 4 life and exiling the last 4 cards of his library. He sacrifices Lion's Eye Diamond, discarding his hand, exiling the cards through Necropotence, and adds 3 blue. He then escapes Thassa's Oracle from his graveyard. It enters, triggers, and Zane wins the game. And Rust gets to start us off. But Mike has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Alseid of Life's Bounty. Rust draws a card for turn and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a mountain onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. He follows up with a Tomb of Legends. It enters with a page counter, and Rust ships the turn. Mike draws and plays a Prismatic Vista. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield. He casts Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Spectator Seeding. Mike casts a Loyal Apprentice. The table groans, and it resolves. Mike moves to combat, and Apprentice triggers, creating a 1/1 Flying Thopter with haste. He attacks Zane with the Apprentice and the Thopter. Winota triggers, and Mike looks at the top 6 and fails to find. Zane takes it, and Mike, with an incredible turn 1 in the books, passes the turn. Zane draws and casts a Mana Crypt. He plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand and passes the turn. Noah draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He passes. Russ draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Jeska's Will, targeting Noah, adding 5 red. He then casts Blasphemous Act. Mike cries, and Blasphemous Act resolves, wiping the table of all creatures. Russ then gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a City of Traitors. He casts Drannith Magistrate. He passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Noah cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Vents onto the battlefield tapped. The turn then moves to Zane. During his upkeep, Zane wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He passes. Noah draws and plays a Shivan Reef. He casts Baral, Chief of Compliance. He ends the turn. Russ draws and casts a Mind Stone. He ends his turn. At the end of Rust's turn, Zane casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Mike draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Zane with Drannith. Zane takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Mike casts Mogcatcher. He ships the turn to Zane. During his upkeep, Zane loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Culling Ritual. In response, Russ activates his Mind Stone, sacrificing it and drawing a card. Russ then activates Tomb of Legends, removing a page counter and drawing a card. Culling Ritual then resolves, wiping the board, and Zane adds 6 black. He casts Ad Nauseam. It resolves, and Zane reveals a Lightning Greaves, Imperial Seal, Bloodstained Mire, Lotus Petal, Chain of Vapor, Mana Vault, Flusterstorm, Wishclaw Talisman, Gemstone Caverns, Fate Stitcher, Underworld Breach, Mnemonic Betrayal, and a Lion's Eye Diamond, deciding to stop there. Zane casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He casts Lotus Petal. He plays a Bloodstained Mire. He casts Chrome Mox. It enters and he imprints Dockside Extortionist. Zane cracks his Lotus Petal to cast Underworld Breach. He cracks his LED, discarding his hand and adding 3 black. He escapes LED from his graveyard. He cracks LED, adding 3 blue. He escapes Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand. Zane then casts Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself, milling 27 cards. Zane escapes LED once again. He cracks it for 3 blue. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, he escapes Demonic Consultation. Consultation resolves, he names Norn the Wary, and exiles his deck. Thassa's Oracle's trigger resolves, and Zane wins the game. Alex screamed the loudest and gets to start us off. Alex draws a card for turn and plays a Snow-Covered Swamp. He casts Blood Pet and passes the turn. Zach draws a card for turn and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts a Mana Vault. He sends the turn to Garner. Garner draws and plays a Plateau. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He ships the turn. Jordan draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts Elvish Mystic. He ends the turn. Alex draws and plays a Snow-Covered Swamp. He sacrifices Blood Pet, adding a black. He casts Tangle Wire. The table groans as they strap in for a long game, and Alex gives the turn to Zach. During Zach's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. During his draw step, he takes a damage through his Mana Vault. He draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns. He passes. During Garner's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He draws and plays Care Keep. He ends his turn. During Jordan's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He draws and plays Turn Timber, Serpentine Wood into play tapped. All through, he passes the turn. During Alex's upkeep, he removes a counter from Tangle Wire, then taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He draws and plays a Snow-Covered Swamp. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. Having locked down everybody's board, including his own, he ships the turn to Zach. During Zach's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. During his draw step, he takes a damage through his Mana Vault. He plays a Misty Rainforest. Zach gives the turn to Garner. During Garner's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He draws, and thanks to Tangle Wire, he has nothing to do, so he passes. During Jordan's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He draws and plays a Plains. He casts Sol Ring. Ready for his next turn, he passes to Alex. During Alex's upkeep, he removes a counter from Tangle Wire, then taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He draws and plays a Snow-Covered Swamp. He casts Feed the Swarm, targeting Ragavan. Ragavan is destroyed, and Alex loses a life. He sacrifices his Lion's Eye Diamond, discards his hand, and adds 3 black. He casts his commander, Turgrid, God of Fright. He passes the turn to Zach. During Zach's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. During his draw step, he takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Turgrid triggers, and Alex puts Misty Rainforest onto the battlefield from Zach's graveyard. Zach casts Mana Crypt. He follows it up with a Felwar Stone. He casts Jeweled Lotus. He sacks his Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. Turgid triggers, and Alex puts Jeweled Lotus onto the battlefield. Zach moves to combat and attacks Alex with Crom. Alex takes it, and Zach ends his turn. During Garner's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He draws, and with nothing else going on, he passes the turn, discarding the hand size. When he discards Blazing Root Walla into exile and then casts it for its madness cost. It resolves, then the turn moves to Jordan. During Jordan's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He draws and plays a Plateau. He casts Carpet of Flowers. He moves to a second main phase and then adds a green through his carpet. He casts Fauna Shaman. Crom triggers, and Zach draws. All through, Jordan ships the turn. During Alex's upkeep, he removes a counter from his Tangle Wire and then taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. He draws and casts Liliana of the Veil. He activates Liliana's first ability, and then everyone discards a card. Turgid triggers, and Alex puts Dress Down onto the battlefield from Zach's graveyard. Dress Down enters, and Alex draws. Alex passes to Zach. At the end of Alex's turn, Dress Down is sacrificed. During Zach's upkeep, he taps his permanents through Tangle Wire. Also during his upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. During his draw step, he takes a damage through his Mana Vault. He draws and casts Ad Nauseam. With no other answers from his opponents, Ad Naus resolves. Zach reveals a Lion's Eye Diamond, Demonic Tutor, Enlightened Tutor, Arcane Signet, Watery Grave, Hallowed Fountain, City of Brass, Thassa's Oracle, Mnemonic Betrayal, Flusterstorm, Arid Mesa, Vampiric Tutor, Simian Spirit Guide, Polluted Delta, Badlands, Demonic Consultation, Toxic Deluge, Ponder, Mox Opal, Esper Sentinel, Lotus Petal, Savine's Reclamation, Talisman of Curiosity, Island, Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, and decides to stop there. He casts Mox Opal. He follows it up with a Lotus Petal. He plays an island for turn. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and in response, Zack cracks his Lotus Petal, adding a black. Turgid triggers, and Alex puts Lotus Petal onto the battlefield from Zack's graveyard. Zack casts Demonic Consultation, naming Hypnox, and exiles his entire library. Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Zack wins the game. Mike had the coolest altered commander, and gets to start us off. Mike draws a card for turn and plays a Plains. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts a Phyrexian Walker. He passes. Ryan draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. He pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe, targeting Okami. He looks at Okami's hand and draws a card. Ryan passes. Okami draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He cracks his Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Croc the Thumbless. He casts a Tinderwall. He casts a Mana Crypt. With a strong turn 1 under his belt, Okami passes. Andrew draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Finehorn Elves. Andrew gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Sokenzan, Crucible of Defiance. He casts his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Phyrexian Walker. Winota triggers, Mike looks at the top 6 and puts a Recruiter of the Guard onto the battlefield tapped and attacking Ryan. Recruiter enters and Mike fetches up a Rograk, Son of Roga, into his hand. Then Ryan takes it, and in his second main phase, Mike casts Rograk. Mike ends his turn. At the end of Mike's turn, Ryan cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Vents onto the battlefield tapped. Ryan draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He passes. During his upkeep, Okami loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Faithless Looting. Croc triggers, Okami loses his roll and returns it to his hand. He sacrifices his Tinderwall, adding 2 red. He casts Faithless Looting again. Croc triggers, and he loses his roll and returns it again. He casts Faithless Looting yet again. Croc triggers, and he loses his roll yet again, returning Faithless Looting for the 3rd time. Okami sighs and passes to Andrew. Andrew draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts his commander, Derevi, Imperial Tactician. It enters and he untaps Exotic Orchard. He casts an Esper Sentinel and passes to Mike. During his draw step, Mike takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He moves to combat, and in response, Ryan cracks his Polluted Delta and pays a life. In response, Mike flashes in an Aven Mind Sensor. It resolves, Ryan looks at the top 4, fails to find, and shuffles. Mike attacks Ryan with Rograk and Phyrexian Walker, and Okami with Winota. Winota triggers twice. Mike looks at the top 6 and puts a Mogcatcher onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Okami. He looks at the top 6 again and fails to find. Okami, frustrated with his lost flips, throws Krark in front of Winota. Krark dies, and everyone takes the rest. With nothing else, Mike ends his turn. Ryan draws and casts a Springleaf Drum. He casts his commander, Rograk, Son of Roga. He curses Aven Mind Sensor and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Okami wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, takes no actions, and passes. Andrew draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He casts a Spellseeker. It enters, and Andrew searches the top 4 through Aven Mind Sensor. He fails to find and shuffles. He moves to combat and attacks Okami with Derevi and Esper Sentinel. Okami takes it, and Derevi triggers twice. Okami untaps Derevi and a land. In his second main phase, he casts an Elvish Mystic. Andrew passes the turn. During his draw step, Mike takes a damage from his Mana Vault. In his main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. Mike moves to combat and attacks Okami with Recruiter of the Guard, Winota, and Aven Mind Sensor, and attacks Ryan with Phyrexian Walker and Rograk. Winota triggers 3 times. Mike looks at the top 6 and puts a Grand Abolisher onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Okami. He looks at the top 6 again and puts a Mother of Runes onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Okami as well. He looks at the top 6 again and fails to find. They all declare no blocks and take the damage. Finished up, Mike passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Pirate as it enters. Ryan ends his turn. During his upkeep, Okami loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Faithless Looting. Esper triggers and Okami pays. He then draws 2 and discards 2. Okami ships the turn to Andrew. Andrew draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle for turn. He casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals 4. He looks at the top 4 through Aven Mind Sensor and fails to find. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Derevi and Okami with Spellseeker and Esper Sentinel. They both take it, Derevi triggers, and Andrew untaps his Derevi, Gaia's Cradle, and Rejuvenating Springs. Andrew passes. At the end of Andrew's turn, Mike activates Mogcatcher, fetching up a Dockside Extortionist onto the battlefield. It enters, and Mike creates 3 treasures. Still in the end step, Andrew pays 2 life to cast Noxious Revival, putting Finale of Devastation from his graveyard onto the top of his library. Still in the end step, Ryan casts Snap, targeting Mogcatcher. Esper triggers, and Andrew draws. Mogcatcher bounces, and Ryan untaps 2 lands. The turn moves to Mike. During his draw step, Mike takes a damage from his Mana Vault. In his main phase, Urza Saga triggers. Mike floats mana and sacrificing it, fetching up a Gingerbrute onto the battlefield. He casts a Lotus Petal. Esper triggers, and Andrew draws. He cracks his petal to help cast Legion Warboss. He moves to combat, and Warboss triggers. Mike creates a 1/1 goblin with haste. He attacks Andrew with Winota and Okami with Gingerbrute, Aven Mind Sensor, Grand Abolisher, Recruiter of the Guard, his Goblin Token, Dockside Extortionist, Phyrexian Walker, and Rograk. Winota triggers 6 times. Mike looks at the top 6 and puts a Combat Celebrant onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Andrew. He looks at the top 6 and puts a Rick, Steadfast Leader, onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Andrew again. Rick enters and Mike chooses First Strike and Lifelink. He looks at the top 6 and puts a Zealous Conscripts onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Andrew. Conscripts enters and Mike gains control of Derevi, untapping it. He looks at the top 6 and puts a Blade Historian onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Andrew. He looks at the top 6 2 more times and fails to find each time. Andrew blocks Combat Celebrant with Elvish Mystic and Winota with Finehorn Elves. They both take the rest. And since many of Mike's creatures now have Double Strike, Lifelink, and +2/+2, Okami dies and Mike gains 54 life. Derevi also triggers about 1 billion times, and Mike untaps all of his creatures, his Mana Vault, and his lands. In his second main phase, he casts Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. He casts an Archon of Emeria. Finally finished up, Mike passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Andrew regains control of his Derevi. Ryan draws, takes no actions, and passes. Andrew draws and casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals 3. He searches the top 4 through Aven Mind Sensor and puts a Malevolent Hermit onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan for 2. Ryan takes it and Derevi triggers. Andrew untaps his Exotic Orchard and passes the turn. At the end of Andrew's turn, Mike flashes in a Village Bellringer, untapping his creatures. During his draw step, Mike takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He moves to combat and Legion War Boss triggers. Mike creates a 1/1 Goblin with haste. Everyone sees the writing on the wall, and they all concede the game to Mike. Sean has the worst spelling of the name Sean, so everyone felt sorry for him and let him go first. Sean draws a card for turn and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Wild Growth, targeting his tropical island. He passes. Taylor draws a card for turn and plays a Spectator Seeding. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts Lightning Greaves. He follows it up with a Rograk, Son of Roga. He equips Rograk with Lightning Greaves. He moves to combat and attacks Ben with Rograk, sending a message. The table laughs and Ben takes 0. The turn moves to Ben. Ben draws and plays a Snow-Covered Forest. He casts Carpet of Flowers. He passes. Mike draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Moth Dust Changeling. He gives the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Tarnished Citadel. He follows it up with a Sylvan Library. He passes. Taylor draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Human as it enters. He casts his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. He moves to combat, and in response, Sean taps his Tarnished Citadel to help cast Swords to Plowshares, targeting Winota. Winota is exiled, and Taylor gains 4 life. Dismayed and with his plan foiled, Taylor passes the turn. Ben draws, and in his first main phase, he adds a green through his Carpet of Flowers. He plays a Command Tower. He casts Argothian Enchantress and ends the turn. Mike draws and plays an Otawara, Soaring City. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with Moth Dust Changeling. Sean declares no blocks, and in response, Mike ninjutsus in his commander, Yuriko the Tiger Shadow, bouncing Moth Dust Changeling to his hand. Sean takes it, and Yuriko triggers. Mike reveals an Ornithopter into his hand. In his second main phase, he casts Ornithopter. All finished up, Mike passes. During his draw step, Sean draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 8 life to keep them both. He plays a Command Tower for turn. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He follows it up with a Llanowar Elves. He ships the turn. Taylor draws and plays a Plains. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Draneth Magistrate. He recasts his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. He moves to combat, and in response, Ben casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Winota. Winota is exiled, and Taylor gains 4 life. Taylor questions whether he's in some sort of time loop, and the table assures him that he's not. He passes. Ben draws, and in his first main phase, he adds a green through his Carpet of Flowers. He casts his commander, Sithis, Harvest Tan. Argothian Enchantress triggers, and he draws. He plays a Bountiful Promenade as his land for turn. He follows it up with a Root Maze. Argothian triggers, and he draws. It enters, and Sithis triggers. Ben draws and gains a life. Sitting in a strong position, Ben passes. Mike draws and casts Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He moves to combat and attacks Taylor with Yuriko. Taylor takes it, and Yuriko triggers. Mike reveals a Seagate Restoration, and each opponent loses 7. In his second main phase, he plays Seagate Reborn into play tapped. He casts Fairy Seer. It enters, and he scries 2. He passes. During his draw step, Sean draws 2 extra through his Sylvan Library, paying 4 life to keep 1 extra. He plays a Forbidden Orchard, entering tap through Root Maze. He taps his Tarnished Citadel to cast his other commander, Bruce Tarl, Boorish Herder. It enters, and Sean gives Thrasios double strike and lifelink until the end of turn. He moves to combat and attacks Taylor with Thrasios. Taylor takes it, and Sean gains 2 life. The turn moves to Taylor. Taylor draws and plays a Plains, entering tap through Root Maze. He casts Zealous Conscripts. It enters, and Taylor gains control of Mike's Yuriko, untapping it. He moves to combat and attacks Ben with Yuriko. Ben blocks with Sithis. Taylor passes. At the end of Taylor's turn, Mike regains control of Yuriko. Ben draws, and in his first main phase, he has a white through his carpet. He casts Seal of Primordium, Argothian Enchantress, and Sithis Trigger. Ben draws 2 and gains 1 life. He casts Utopia Sprawl, targeting his forest. Argothian and Sithis Trigger again, and Ben draws 2 and gains a life again. Utopia Sprawl enters, and Ben names white. He casts Miri's Guile. Argothian and Sithis Trigger, Ben draws 2 and gains a life. With a million cards in hand, Ben passes, discarding to hand size. Mike draws and decides it's time to deal with the problem at the table. He pays 4 life to help cast Dismember, killing Sithis. He moves to combat and attacks Ben with Fairy Seer, Ornithopter, and Yuriko. Ben declares no blocks, and Mike ninjutsus in Skull Snatcher, returning Ornithopter to his hand. Ben takes it, Yuriko triggers twice, and Skull Snatcher triggers. Mike exiles Swords to Plowshares and Arid Mesa from Ben's graveyard. Then Yuriko's triggers resolve, Mike reveals Tetsuko Umizawa Fugitive into his hand, with each opponent losing 2, and Darkslick Shores into his hand. In his second main phase, he casts Ornithopter. He plays a tap Darkslick Shores. He passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Sean casts Worldly Tutor. He fetches up a Seedborn Muse onto the top of his library. Still in the end step, Ben sacrifices Seal of Primordium, destroying Sean's Wild Growth. The turn moves to Sean. During his draw step, Sean draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 4 life to keep 1 extra. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Bruce Tarl. Bruce triggers and targets itself. Mike takes it, and Sean gains 6 life. In his second main phase, Sean casts Drannith Magistrate. He gives the turn to Taylor. Taylor draws and plays a snow-covered mountain into play tapped. He casts Phyrexian Revoker. In response, Sean casts Spell Snare, countering Revoker. Taylor moves to combat and attacks Sean with Zealous Conscripts. Sean takes it, and Taylor passes the turn. During his upkeep, Miri's Guile triggers. Ben looks at and rearranges the top 3 cards of his library. He draws, and in his first main phase, he adds a white through his carpet. He plays a Horizon Canopy, tapped. He casts Idyllic Tutor. He fetches up a Sanctum Weaver into his hand. He casts Sanctum Weaver. He passes. Mike draws and casts Tetsuko Umizawa Fugitive. He moves to combat and attacks Ben with Fairy Seer, Skull Snatcher, and Yuriko. Ben takes it, Yuriko triggers twice, and Skull Snatcher triggers. Mike exiles Seal of Primordium and Idyllic Tutor from Ben's graveyard. Then Yuriko's trigger resolves, Mike reveals Crippling Fear into his hand, with each opponent losing 4, and a Misty Rainforest into his hand. In his second main phase, he plays an Underground River into play tapped. He casts Moth-Dust Changeling. He follows it up with a Memnite. It enters tapped, and Mike ships the turn. During his draw step, Sean draws 2 extra through his Sylvan Library and puts 2 back on top. He immediately moves to combat and attacks Ben with Bruce Tarl. Bruce triggers and targets itself. Ben takes it, and Sean gains 6 life. In his second main phase, he taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Ben a 1/1 spirit to help cast Seedborn Muse. 1 by 1, the table pass priority and Seedborn resolves. Sitting in a very strong position, Sean passes. Sean untaps with Taylor through Seedborn. Taylor draws and casts Captain of the Watch. It enters, and Taylor creates 3 1/1 soldiers. He equips his Captain of the Watch with Lightning Greaves. He moves to combat and attacks Ben with Captain of the Watch and Zealous Conscripts. Zen blocks Zealous with his 1/1 spirit. Ben takes the rest, and then Taylor passes. At the end of Taylor's turn, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Green Sun Zenith into his hand. The turn moves to Ben. Sean untaps with Ben through Seedborn. During his upkeep, Ben's Miri's Guile triggers. In response, Sean channels Beseiju, who endures, targeting Sanctum Weaver. In response, Ben flows 5 green through Sanctum Weaver. Weaver is destroyed, and Ben fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield tapped. Then Miri's Guile trigger resolves, and he looks at and rearranges the top 3. He draws, and in his first main phase, he adds a white through his carpet. He casts On Thin Ice, enchanting his snow-covered forest. Argothian Enchantress triggers, and Ben draws. On Thin Ice resolves and exiles Seedborn Muse. He follows up with a Green Sun Zenith where X equals 2. In response, Sean taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Ben a 1/1 spirit to help activate Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Breeding Pool onto the battlefield tapped. Then Green Suns resolves, and Ben fetches up a Destiny Spinner onto the battlefield, shuffling Green Suns back into his library. He plays a Razorverge Thicket into play tapped. He casts Llanowar Elves. Ben gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws, and in his first main phase, he taps his Ornithopter to give Moth-Dust Changeling flying until end of turn. He moves to combat and attacks Ben with Moth-Dust Changeling, Yuriko, Fairy Seer, Tetsuko, Skull Snatcher, and Memnite. Ben takes it, and Yuriko triggers 3 times. Mike reveals a Marsh Flats into his hand, Ninja of the Deep Hours into his hand with each opponent losing 4, and Prosperous Fief into his hand with each opponent losing 3. Ben dies, and Seedborn Muse returns to the battlefield under Sean's control. In his second main phase, Mike plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a swamp onto the battlefield. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Gemstone Caverns. He casts Crippling Fear, choosing ninjas. The non-ninjas on the board are all nuked, and then Mike follows it up with a Cursed Totem. Now sitting in a very commanding board position, Mike ships the turn. Sean draws and casts Crow Mox, imprinting Green Sun Zenith. He taps Forbidden Orchard, giving Mike a spirit to help cast his commander, Bruce Tarl, Boorish Herder. It enters, and Sean gives Seedborn Double Strike and Lifelink until the end of turn. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Seedborn. Mike blocks with his spirit, and Sean gains 2 life. All finished up, Sean passes. Taylor draws and recasts his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. He casts Ornithopter. He equips Ornithopter with Lightning Greaves. He moves to combat and, in response, might cast Chain of Vapor, bouncing Winota. Taylor sacrifices the plains to continue the chain, bouncing Seedborn Muse. Sean decides to stop the chain there. Taylor, really hoping next game that he can get a Winota trigger, passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an island onto the battlefield. He casts Prosperous Thief. He moves to combat and attacks Taylor with Moth Dust Changeling, Yuriko, and Skull Snatcher. Taylor blocks Moth Dust Changeling with Ornithopter and takes the rest. Yuriko triggers twice along with Skull Snatcher and Prosperous Thief. Mike creates a treasure and exiles 2 cards from Taylor's graveyard. Yuriko's triggers resolve and Mike reveals a Watery Grave into his hand and a Demonic Tutor into his hand with each opponent losing 2. In his second main phase, Mike casts Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand and then immediately delves away some of his graveyard to cast Temporal Trespass. It resolves and Mike gets an extra turn. He passes to, well, himself. Mike draws and immediately moves to combat, attacking Taylor with Moth Dust Changeling, Yuriko, Prosperous Thief, and Skull Snatcher. Taylor blocks Moth Dust Changeling with Ornithopter and takes the rest. Yuriko triggers 3 times along with 1 Skull Snatcher and Prosperous Thief trigger. Mike creates a treasure and exiles 2 cards from Taylor's graveyard. Then Yuriko's triggers resolve and Mike reveals a Mystical Tutor into his hand with each opponent losing 1. With his other Yuriko triggers still on the stack, he casts Mystical Tutor. He fetches up a Dig Through Time onto the top of his library. He reveals a Dig Through Time through Yuriko and each opponent loses 8. Sean dies, and with his final Yuriko trigger on the stack, Mike delves away some of his graveyard to help cast Dig Through Time. He looks at the top 7 cards of his library, puts 2 into his hand and the rest on bottom. Then Yuriko's final trigger resolves and he reveals a Swan Song into his hand with each opponent losing 1. In his second main phase, Mike casts Ninja of the Deep Hours. He plays a Watery Grave into play tapped. He passes to Taylor. During Taylor's upkeep, Mike invokes Magic Tournament Rule 3.13, revealing his hand full of counter magic, asking if Taylor would like to concede the game. Taylor, unfazed, decides to keep fighting. He draws and recasts his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. He casts Aven Mind Sensor. In response, Mike casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, countering Aven. Taylor equips his Winota with Lightning Greaves. He attacks Mike with Winota and Ornithopter, and finally, after a grueling game, gets a Winota trigger. The audience cheers, and Taylor looks at the top 6 cards of his library, putting Mentor of the Meek into play tapped and attacking Mike. Mike declares no blocks and takes it all. Satisfied with his single Winota trigger, Taylor sees the writing on the wall, concedes, and Mike wins the game. Kevin wins the Double Master Booster Box Challenge and gets to start us off. Kevin draws a card for turn and plays a Taiga. He casts Ignoble Hierarch. He casts Chalice of the Void, where X equals 0. The table groans and knows what type of game this is going to be. He passes. Josh draws a card for turn and plays a Steam Vents into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Springleaf Drum. He passes. Matt draws and plays a Cephalid Coliseum. He angrily stares at Chalice of the Void and takes no other actions. He gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a plateau onto the battlefield. He casts Giver of Runes. He ends his turn. Kevin draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Timna the Weaver. He ships the turn. Josh draws and plays a Fiery Islet. He passes. Matt draws and plays a Snow-Covered Island. He gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts Drannith Magistrate. In response, Josh casts Mystical Tutor. He fetches up a Lightning Bolt onto the top of his library. With Drannith still on the stack, Matt taps his Cephalid Coliseum to help cast Counterspell, countering Drannith. All finished up, Mike passes. Kevin draws and casts Loyal Apprentice. He moves to combat and Loyal Apprentice triggers, creating a 1/1 Flying Thopter with haste. He swings Timna at Josh, Loyal Apprentice at Matt, and the Thopter at Mike. They all take it and Kevin gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Kevin pays 3 life and draws 3 through Timna. Kevin says he's living the Timna dream and the table laughs. He plays a Plateau for turn. He casts Collector Roof. He passes. Josh draws, takes no actions, and passes. Matt draws and plays a Blast Zone. It enters with a charge counter. He takes no other actions and gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and casts Serra Ascendant. He ships the turn. Kevin draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He casts Mayhem Devil. He casts Sylvan Safekeeper. In response, Josh casts Lightning Bolt, killing Timna. Kevin moves to combat and attacks Josh with Loyal Apprentice and Collector Oof. Josh takes it, and all finished up, Kevin passes. Josh draws, and a single tear rolls down his cheek as he takes no other actions and passes. Matt draws and plays an Inventor's Fair. He taps his Cephalid Coliseum to help cast his commander, Urza, Lord High Artificer. Urza enters and he creates a construct. Matt ends his turn. Mike draws and immediately moves to combat, attacking Kevin with Serra Ascendant. Kevin blocks with a Thopter, and Mike gains 6 life. In his second main phase, Mike casts Ethersworn Canonist. He ships the turn to Kevin. Kevin draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks his Flooded Strand and Verdant Catacombs, paying 2 life total. Mayhem Devil triggers twice, both targeting Giver of Runes. In response, Mike taps Giver of Runes to give Ethersworn Canonist protection from red until end of turn. Giver of Runes dies, and Kevin fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield and a Bayou onto the battlefield. He recasts his commander, Timna the Weaver. He moves to combat, and Loyal Apprentice triggers, creating a Thopter. He attacks Matt with a Thopter, and Josh with Mayhem Devil, Loyal Apprentice, and Collector Oof. Everyone takes it, and in his second main phase, Kevin pays 2 and draws 2 through Timna. With nothing else, he ships the turn to Josh. Josh draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and Mayhem Devil triggers, dealing 1 damage to Matt's construct, killing it. Josh fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He taps his Fiery Islet to help cast Imperial Recruiter. It enters, and he fetches up a Dockside Extortionist into his hand. Josh gives the turn to Matt. Matt draws and casts Imposter Mech. It enters as a copy of Mayhem Devil. The table regains some hope against the tyrant named Kevin, and Matt gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and immediately moves to combat. He attacks Kevin with Sarah Ascendant. Kevin takes it, and Mike gains 6. All finished up, Mike ends his turn. Kevin draws and immediately moves to combat. Loyal Apprentice triggers, and he creates a Thopter. He attacks Josh with Mayhem Devil and Collector Oof, Matt with Timna, and Mike with a Thopter. Matt blocks Timna with Urza, and Kevin gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Kevin pays 2 and draws 2 through Timna. He plays a Blood Crypt, into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Sanctum Prelate. It enters, and Kevin names 2. The table starts to lose all hope again, and Kevin ends his turn. Josh draws and casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and he creates 5 treasures. He passes. At the end of Josh's turn, Matt taps Cephalid Coliseum to activate Blast Zone, adding a counter. The turn moves to Matt. Matt draws and channels Ottawara Soaring City, targeting Chalice of the Void. It resolves, and Chalice is bounced. Matt casts Everflowing Chalice where X equals 0. He casts Jeweled Lotus. He casts Jeweled Amulet. He casts Malevolent Hermit. He passes. At this point, you might be wondering, how does Matt tap his artifacts when there's a Collector Oof out? Well, Urza's ability doesn't actually get stopped by Collector Oof because it's an activated ability of Urza, the creature, not the artifact itself. Anyway, back to the game. Mike draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and both Mayhem Devils trigger. Kevin targets Imperial Recruiter, and Matt targets Loyal Apprentice. Loyal Apprentice and Imperial Recruiter die, then Mike fetches up a Sacred Foundry into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Professional Facebreaker. He moves to combat and attacks Josh with Ethersworn Canonist and Matt with Sarah Ascendant. They both take it, and Mike gains 6 life. Facebreaker triggers twice, and Mike creates 2 treasures. He casts Ornithopter. He gives the turn to Kevin. Kevin draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Elesh Norn, Grand Cenobite. In response, Josh casts Force to Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, countering Elesh Norn. Kevin moves to combat and attacks Josh with Collector Oof, Mayhem Devil, and Timna. Josh takes it, and Kevin gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Kevin pays 1 and draws 1 through Timna. Finished up, Kevin passes the turn. Josh draws and taps his Fiery Islet to help cast his commander, Eruth, Tormented Prophet. He passes. Matt draws and starts off his turn by tapping at Cephalid Coliseum to slam down a Hullbreaker Horror. With Hullbreaker Horror being uncounterable, the table prepares for the worst, and it resolves. Matt casts Mox Diamond. Hullbreaker triggers, targeting Jeweled Lotus. In response, Mike activates Professional Facebreaker, sacrificing a treasure. Both Mayhem Devils trigger, Kevin targets Malevolent Hermit, and Matt targets Sylvan Safekeeper. Both are destroyed, then Facebreaker's ability resolves, and Mike exiles an Ancient Tomb. Still in response to the Hullbreaker trigger, Kevin casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, changing the Hullbreaker trigger to target Hullbreaker Horror itself. Hullbreaker is bounced, and then Matt doesn't discard a land, and Mox Diamond goes to the graveyard. He plays a War Room. All finished up, and with his victory thwarted, he gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and immediately moves to combat. He attacks Josh with Sarah Ascendant and Matt with Professional Facebreaker. They both take it, and Mike gains 6 life. Facebreaker triggers twice, and Mike creates 2 treasures. Mike passes. Kevin draws and casts Mox Diamond, discarding Polluted Delta. He attacks Matt with a Thopter, and Ignoble Hierarch triggers, giving it +1/+1. Matt takes it, and in his second main phase, Kevin pays 1 and draws 1 through Timna. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He recasts Chalice of the Void where X equals 0. All through, Kevin passes. During his draw step, Josh exiles Snap and Wooded Foothills off of the top of his library through Eruth. He plays a Wooded Foothills. All finished up, he gives the turn to Matt. Matt draws, takes no actions, and passes. Mike draws and immediately moves to combat. He attacks Kevin with Sarah Ascendant. Kevin blocks with a Thopter, and Mike gains 6. In his second main phase, he casts Spirit of the Labyrinth. He passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Kevin flashes in an Aven Mind Sensor. Kevin draws and immediately moves to combat. He attacks Josh with Aven Mind Sensor, killing him. In his second main phase, Timna triggers and Kevin declines to draw. He casts Elvish Mystic. He passes. At the end of Kevin's turn, Matt activates War Room, paying a life and drawing a card. Matt also activates Blast Zone, putting another counter on it. The turn moves to Matt. Matt draws and casts Rhystic Study. He passes. Mike draws and plays a Sunbaked Canyon. He taps it to help cast his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. Rhystic triggers and Matt draws. Winota resolves and he moves to combat, attacking Matt with Professional Facebreaker and Ornithopter and Kevin with Sarah's Ascendant. Winota triggers, Mike looks at the top 6 and puts Thalia's Lancers onto the battlefield tapped and attacking Kevin. Lancers trigger and Mike searches the top 4 due to Avon Mind Sensor. He fails to find and then Kevin blocks Thalia's Lancers with Collector Oof. Before damage, Matt taps his Cephalid Coliseum to sacrifice Blast Zone. Both Mayhem Devils trigger, and Kevin targets the Spirit of the Labyrinth and Matt targets Ignoble Hierarch. Kevin then floats mana from Ignoble Hierarch before both it and Spirit of the Labyrinth are destroyed. Still before damage, Kevin uses his floating mana to help flash in an opposition agent. Finally, damage happens and Mike gains 6 life. All finished up, Mike gives the turn to Kevin. Kevin draws and pays 2 life to help cast Birthing Pod. In response, Mike sacrifices a treasure, adding a white. Mayhem Devil triggers, targeting Kevin's opposition agent. In response, Kevin casts Veil of Summer. In response, Mike sacrifices another treasure and adds a red. Mayhem Devil triggers and deals 1 damage to Kevin's opposition agent. Then Mike sacrifices his last treasure, adding a white. Mayhem Devil triggers, dealing 1 damage and killing Kevin's opposition agent. Then Kevin's Veil resolves and he draws a card. He pays 2 life to help activate Birthing Pod, sacrificing Elvish Mystic. He fetches up a Grand Abolisher onto the battlefield. He casts Thorn of Amethyst. With nothing else, Kevin gives the turn to Matt. Matt draws and plays a snow-covered island. He casts Spellskite. He ships the turn. Mike draws and immediately moves to combat. He attacks Kevin with Sarah Ascendant, Ornithopter, Thalia's Lancers, and Winota. Winota triggers, Mike looks at the top 6 and fails to find. Kevin blocks Thalia's Lancers with Grand Abolisher, takes the rest, and Mike gains 6. In his second main phase, he plays a Mana Confluence. He cracks his Sunbaked Canyon to draw a card. Mayhem Devil triggers, dealing 1 damage to Kevin. Mike casts Alseid of Life's Bounty. He ends his turn. Kevin draws and taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast his other commander, Tana the Bloodsower. He pays 2 life to help activate Birthing Pod, sacrificing Tana. He fetches up a Karmic Guide onto the battlefield. It enters and he returns Elesh Norn to the battlefield. Ornithopter and Ethersworn die, and satisfied with his turn, Kevin passes. At the end of Kevin's turn, Matt taps his Cephalid Coliseum to flash in Hullbreaker Horror. Matt draws and casts Gilded Drake. Hullbreaker triggers and bounces Chalice of the Void. Drake enters and exchanges control with Elesh Norn. Matt casts March of Swirling Mists where X equals 0. Hullbreaker triggers and targets Thorn of Amethyst. In response, Mike taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Path to Exile, targeting Hullbreaker Horror. In response, Matt pays 2 life to help activate Spellskite, redirecting Path of Exile to itself. Path resolves, Spellskite is exiled, and Matt declines to search for a land. Then Thorn is bounced and Matt follows it up by tapping Cephalid Coliseum to sacrifice his Inventor's Fair. He fetches up a Mana Crypt into his hand. He casts Mana Crypt. Hullbreaker triggers and bounces Jeweled Lotus. He presents a loop of casting and bouncing Mana Crypt and Jeweled Lotus through Hullbreaker Horror, tapping them for mana before he returns them to his hand. He generates infinite mana. He activates Urza, like a lot of times. He exiles and casts Sensei's Divining Top, Mana Vault, Winter Orb, Back to Basics, and Witching Well. Hullbreaker triggers for each and he bounces his opponent's non-land permanents. He casts Narset, Parter of Veils. He casts Time Spiral. He holds priority and casts Narset's Reversal, targeting his own Time Spiral. Time Spiral is bounced to his hand and he creates a copy of it. Everyone shuffles their graveyards and hands into their libraries. Matt draws 7 and his opponents only draw 1 because of Narset. He presents a loop of activating Urza, exiling his library to cast and counter his own spells with Swan Song to create a 2/2 bird. He then casts Time Spiral and uses Narset's Reversal to bounce and copy Time Spiral, starting the loop over again. He creates infinite 2/2 birds this way. He passes the turn to his opponents, who have no cards in hand and no non-land permanents in play. One by one, they pass back to him, knowing nothing they cast will resolve. On his turn, he swings his infinite birds at each of them, and Matt wins the game. Cal won the game of musical chairs and gets to start us off. Cal draws a card for turn and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He ends the turn. Mike draws and pays 2 life to cast Jataxian Probe, targeting Cal. He looks at Cal's hand and draws a card. He plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts Toxic Deluge, paying 2 life as an additional cost. Cal wonders what in the world Mike is doing, and Malcolm dies. Mike laughs and passes the turn. Phil draws and plays a Plains. He casts Alseid of Life's Bounty. He passes to Caleb. Caleb draws and plays a Forest. He casts a Finehorn Elves. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices the Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Zavala, Heart of the Wilds. He ends his turn. During Cal's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts an Elvish Mystic. He passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Timna the Weaver. He ends the turn. Phil draws and plays a Battlefield Forge. He casts a Mana Crypt. He taps Battlefield Forge to help cast his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Alciid. Winota triggers, Phil looks at the top 6 and puts Thalia's Lancers onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Caleb. Lancers enters and Phil fetches up a Squee, Dubious Monarch, into his hand. They all take it and Phil passes the turn. Caleb draws and plays a Forest. He casts a Temur Sabertooth. He passes the turn. During his upkeep, Cal wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays an Otawara, Soin City as his land for turn. He casts a Birds of Paradise. He recasts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He ends his turn. Mike draws and moves to combat. He attacks Cal with Timna. Cal takes it and Mike gains 2 life. In his second main phase, he pays a life and draws a card through Timna. He plays a Volcanic Island. He casts Ad Nauseam. With no answers, Ad Nause resolves. He reveals an Opposition Agent, Wheel of Fortune, Ancient Tomb, Demonic Consultation, Gemstone Caverns, City of Brass, Lavinia, Azorius Renegade, Swansong, Savine's Reclamation, Demonic Tutor, Underground Sea, Force of Will, Thassa's Oracle, Otawara Soaring City, Gamble, Jeweled Lotus, Brain Freeze, Final Fortune, Swords to Plowshares, Mnemonic Betrayal, Polluted Delta, Forbidden Orchard, Mystic Remora, and a Mindbreak Trap, killing him. The turn moves to Phil. During his upkeep, Phil wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts Squee, Dubious Monarch. He casts a Gingerbrute. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with everything. Winota triggers 3 times and Squee triggers. Phil creates a 1/1 Goblin token tapped and attacking Cal. Then Phil looks at the top 6 and puts Blade Historian onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Cal. He looks at the next 6, putting Ethersworn Canonist onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Caleb. He looks at the next 6 one last time and puts Recruiter of the Guard onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Cal. Recruiter of the Guard triggers and Phil fetches up a Solitude into his hand. With no blocks, Caleb takes 4 and Cal takes 32. Phil passes the turn to Caleb. Caleb draws and casts Rishkar's Expertise. He draws 4 cards, but cannot cast anything for free due to Ethersworn Canonist. He moves to combat and attacks Phil with Temur Sabertooth. Phil declares no blocks and takes it. Caleb passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt flip, takes 3 damage, and dies. During his upkeep, Phil wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and moves directly to combat. He attacks Caleb with everything. Winota triggers 4 times and Squee triggers. Phil creates a 1/1 Goblin token, tapped and attacking Caleb. Then Phil looks at the top 6 and puts a Grand Abolisher onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Caleb. He looks at the next 6 and puts a Magus of the Moon onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. He looks at the next 6 and puts Mother of Runes onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. He then looks at the last 6 and fails to find. Then Caleb takes 48 damage, dies, and Phil wins the game. And Cal gets to start us off. But Lua and Ian have pregame actions. Lua puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Vryn Wingmare. Ian also puts the Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Windswept Heath. Cal draws a card for turn and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts Elvish Mystic. He passes the turn. Lua draws and plays an Arid Mesa. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield. She casts a Drannith Magistrate. She gives the turn to Brian. Brian draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He ships the turn. Ian draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts Mox Amber. He casts Mystic Remora. He ends his turn. Cal draws, plays a Windswept Heath, and passes. At the end of Cal's turn, Brian cracks his Marsh Flats, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. Lua draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. She casts Spirit of the Labyrinth. She cracks Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. She casts Skrelv, Deflector Might. She moves to combat and attacks Brian with Drannith. Brian takes it, and Lua passes. Brian draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He gives the turn to Ian. During his upkeep, Ian pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Breeding Pool onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Talisman of Curiosity. He casts Mox Opal. Ian passes. At the end of Ian's turn, Cal cracks his Windswept Heath, pays a life, and fetches up a Stomping Ground onto the battlefield tapped. Cal draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts Vexing Shusher. He ships the turn to Lua. Lua draws and plays a Shattered Skull, the Hammer Pass, into play untapped, paying 3 life. She casts her commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. In response, Brian casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Winota. Mystic Remora triggers and Ian draws. Force of Will resolves, countering Winota. Lua moves to combat and attacks Brian with Spirit of the Labyrinth and Drannith. Brian takes the hit, and Lua ends the turn. Brian draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts Talisman of Dominance, and Ian draws through Remora. He casts an Arcane Signet, and Ian draws again. Brian passes to Ian. During his upkeep, Ian lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Homeward Path. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts Consecrated Sphinx. He gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and Consecrated Sphinx triggers. Ian draws 1 due to Spirit of the Labyrinth. Cal does nothing else and ends the turn. Lua draws, Consecrated Sphinx triggers, and Ian draws 1 due to Spirit. Lua plays a City of Brass and moves to combat. She attacks Brian with Draneth and the Spirit. Brian takes it, and Lua passes. Brian draws, Sphinx triggers, and Ian draws 1. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Plateau. He casts a Grim Monolith. He ships the turn to Ian. During his draw step, Ian takes a damage through his Mana Vault. He moves to combat, attacking Lua with Consecrated Sphinx. Lua takes it, and in his second main phase, Ian casts Wandering Archaic. In response, Brian casts Ad Nauseam. In response, Cal casts Swan Song, targeting Ad Nauseam. Ad Nauseam is countered, and Brian creates a 2/2 bird. Wandering Archaic resolves, and Ian passes the turn. At the end of Ian's turn, Cal casts Worldly Tutor. Wandering Archaic triggers, and Cal taps Ancient Tomb to pay for it. Worldly Tutor resolves, and Cal fetches up a Spellseeker onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Cal. Cal draws, Consecrated Sphinx triggers, and Ian draws 1. He takes no other actions and passes to Lua. Lua draws, Sphinx triggers, and Ian draws 1. She plays a Windswept Heath for turn. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield. She recasts her commander, Winota. She moves to combat and attacks Brian with everything. Winota triggers twice. Lua looks at the top 6, putting Engrath's Marauders onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ian. She looks at the next 6, putting Imperial Recruiter onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ian. Imperial Recruiter triggers, and Lua fetches up a Rograk, Son of Rogaw, into her hand. Brian blocks the Spirit with his bird, and Ian blocks Imperial Recruiter with Wandering Archaic. Spirit dies, and then they both take the rest. In her second main phase, she casts Rograk. She ends her turn. Brian draws, and since Spirit of the Labyrinth is no longer on the battlefield, Ian draws 2 through Consecrated Sphinx. He does nothing else and passes. At the end of Brian's turn, Ian casts Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He then casts a Worldly Tutor, fetching up a Hullbreaker Horror onto the top of his library. Brian gives the turn to Ian. Ian draws and casts Hullbreaker Horror. He plays a Gaia's Cradle and then taps it for 3 green. He casts a Spellskite. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, and Ian returns Mox Opal to his hand. He casts Mox Opal, returning Mana Vault to his hand. He demonstrates a loop by casting and bouncing Mox Opal and Mana Vault, producing infinite mana of all colors. He ends the loop by bouncing Draneth Magistrate. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He activates Kinnan an infinite number of times, putting all of his non-humans onto the battlefield, including Thrasios, Triton Hero. He activates Thrasios, drawing his deck and putting all of his lands onto the battlefield tapped. He then casts Finalia Devastation, where X equals 69,420, pumping all of his creatures, giving them haste, and then moving to combat. He attacks with everything, and Ian wins the game. Nick wins the Ugly Sweater contest and gets to start us off. Nick draws a card for turn and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts an Arbor Elf and passes the turn. Peter draws, plays a Swamp, and gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Mountain. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Professional Facebreaker. Mike ends his turn. Ashani draws and plays a Nurturing Peatland. He taps it to cast Elvish Mystic. He passes. At the end of Ashani's turn, Peter casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. The turn moves to Nick. Nick draws and plays a Savannah. He casts Sardian Avenger. He casts Dryad Militant. Nick ships the turn to Peter. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Grim Monolith. Peter pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, Son of Yawgmoth. He pays 4 life and casts a Grim Tutor. Kirik triggers and gets a 1/1 counter, and then Peter fetches up a card into his hand, losing 3 life. Then Grim Tutor's exiled through Dryad Militant. Peter pays 6 life and casts Necropotence. Kirik triggers and gets another counter. It resolves, and he activates Necropotence 7 times, paying 7 life and exiling 7 cards. He moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. Peter passes, discarding to hand size, exiling the discarded cards. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Phoenix Chick. He moves to combat, attacking Peter with Facebreaker and Ashani with Phoenix Chick. They both take it, Facebreaker triggers, and Mike creates 2 treasures. In his second main phase, Mike cracks a treasure and casts Ethersworn Canonist. Sardian Avenger triggers, and Mike takes the damage. He plays Shatter Skull, the Hammer Pass, into play tapped, and passes the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Blood Crypt, into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Ashani creates 6 treasures. He ends his turn. Nick draws and plays a Horizon Canopy. He taps it to help cast Grand Abolisher. Nick moves to combat and attacks Peter with 12 with his first striking, trampling Sardian Avenger. Peter is forced to block with Kirik and takes the rest. All through, Nick passes the turn to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter's Mana Crypt triggers. With his life on the line, he rolls and wins. He skips his draw step due to Necropotence. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He plays a Swamp. He casts Sheoldred the Apocalypse. He casts Sensei's Divining Top. Peter ships the turn to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt roll. During his draw step, he loses 2 life through Sheoldred. He plays a Mana Confluence for turn. He taps it to help cast his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Facebreaker and Ashani with Phoenix Chick. Winota triggers, and in response, Peter saves himself from death by activating top, drawing a card, and putting top on top, gaining 2 life through Shieldred. Then Mike looks at the top 6 and puts a Zealous Conscripts onto the battlefield tapped and attacking Ashani. Zealous Conscripts triggers and Mike gains control of Necropotence. Ashani blocks Conscripts with Dockside and then they both take the rest. Facebreaker triggers and Mike creates 2 treasures. In his second main phase, he activates Necropotence 7 times, paying 7 life, exiling 7 cards. He moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. He passes, Necropotence goes back under Peter's control, and then he discards the hand size. Ashani draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He cracks 6 treasures, taking 6 damage from Sardian Avenger, and then casts Culling Ritual. In response, Nick activates Arbor Elf, untapping Savannah. In response, Peter cracks Jeweled Lotus and takes a damage from Sardian Avenger. Mike activates Facebreaker, sacrificing a treasure, exiling a Marius Call off of the top of his library, taking a damage from the Avenger. Mike activates Facebreaker again, exiling Loyal Apprentice. Avenger triggers and Mike takes another damage. Mike cracks a treasure and adds a white. Avenger triggers and he takes another damage. With no other responses, Ashani's Culling Ritual resolves, destroying all non-land permanents 2 or less, and he has 4 green and 7 black. Ashani casts Ad Nauseam. With no responses, it resolves. Ashani reveals a Grinding Station, Autumn's Veil, Grim Monolith, Stomping Ground, Verdant Catacombs, Gamble, Imperial Seal, Overgrown Tomb, City of Brass, Elvish Spirit Guide, Badlands, Mayhem Devil, Arid Mesa, Culling the Weak, Demonic Tutor, Squandered Resources, and a Mana Vault, deciding to stop there. Ashani casts a Mana Vault. He casts a Demonic Tutor, fetching up a card into his hand. He casts Underworld Breach. He casts Grinding Station. Since Grinding Station sees itself entering, its second ability triggers. So in response, Ashani sacrifices his Mana Vault and mills 3 cards. Then Grinding Station untaps. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards Squandered Resources. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. It enters and Grinding Station triggers. In response, he activates Station, sacrificing his LED and milling 3. Ashani escapes LED. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He cracks LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 red. He escapes LED again. Ashani presents a loop of activating Grinding Station, sacrificing LED, milling 3 cards, then escaping LED to untap Grinding Station. He does this until he mills a Twin Flame. He escapes Ignoble Hierarch. He escapes Twin Flame, targeting the Hierarch. He holds priority and escapes Dualcaster Mage. Dualcaster enters and triggers, targeting Twin Flame. In response, Nick attempts to stop the inevitability by casting Path to Exile, targeting Dualcaster Mage. In response, Ashani escapes Deflecting SWAT. SWAT resolves, redirecting Path of Exile to Ignoble Hierarch. Hierarch is exiled and Ashani declines to search. With no other responses, Dualcaster creates a copy of Twin Flame. Twin Flame targets Dualcaster, creating another copy. Ashani presents a loop of creating infinite hasty Dualcasters through Twin Flame. He moves to combat and attacks each opponent, and Ashani wins the game. And Mike gets to start us off. But Ashani has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Overgrown Tomb. Mike draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast Signal Pest. He casts an Ornithopter. He passes the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He casts Ignoble Hierarch. He ends his turn. Nick draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts a Deafening Silence. He gives the turn to Peter. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Soul Ring and passes. Mike draws and plays a Needle Verge Pathway. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Goblin Rabble Master. He moves to combat, Rabble Master triggers, and Mike creates a 1/1 Goblin with haste. He attacks Peter with the Goblin, Ornithopter, and Signal Pest. Signal Pest's Battlecry triggers, buffing Mike's other creatures. Peter takes the damage, and in his second main phase, Mike casts Rograk, Son of Roga. Mike passes the turn. At the end of Mike's turn, Ashani cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up a Blood Crypt onto the battlefield tapped. Ashani draws and plays a City of Traders. He casts a Witchclaw Talisman. He activates Witchclaw Talisman, fetches up a card into his hand, and then gives the Witchclaw to Peter. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and Ashani creates 5 treasures. He casts his commander, Corvold, Fakehurst King. Corvold enters, and Ashani sacrifices Dockside. Corvold triggers, he gets a 1/1 counter, and Ashani draws a card. He ships the turn to Nick. Nick draws and plays a Brushland. He casts Ragaman, Nimble Pilferer. He taps his Brushland to help cast Weathered Wayfarer. Nick passes the turn. Peter draws and casts Reanimate, targeting Dockside in Ashani's graveyard. Dockside enters, and Peter loses 2 life. Dockside triggers, and Peter creates 3 treasures. He pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, Son of Yawgmoth. He gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a City of Brass. He moves to combat, Rabble Master triggers, and he creates a Goblin. In response, Peter pays 2 life to cast Cut Down, targeting Signal Pest. Kirik triggers and gets a 1/1 counter. Signal Pest dies, and Mike attacks Nick with his 2 goblins. Nick takes it, and with nothing else, Mike passes the turn. During Ashani's upkeep, Peter casts Deadly Rollick for its alternate cost, targeting Corvold. Kirik triggers and gets a counter. In response, Ashani flashes in a Dualcaster Mage. Dualcaster enters and creates a copy of Deadly Relic targeting Kirik. Both relics resolve and Kirik and Korbold are exiled. Ashani draws and casts Skirk Prospector. He ships the turn. Nick draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle. He taps his Brushland to help cast Ranger Captain of Eos. Ranger enters and Nick fetches up a Birds of Paradise into his hand. He casts Birds of Paradise and moves to combat. He attacks Mike with Ragavan. Mike takes it, Ragavan triggers, Mike exiles Blade Historian, and Nick creates a treasure. Nick passes the turn to Peter. Peter draws and activates Wishclaw Talisman. He fetches up a card into his hand and gives the Wishclaw to Ashani. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. Peter pays 6 life and recasts his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. Finished up, he passes. At the end of Peter's turn, Mike taps the City of Brass to help cast Path to Exile, targeting his own Goblin token. Goblin is exiled, and Mike fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield. Everyone knowing that this is how White ramps, they take pity on Mike, and he moves to his turn. Mike draws and casts a Mana Crypt. He taps the City of Brass to help cast his commander, Winota, join our forces. Mike moves to combat, and in response, Nick activates Weathered Wayfarer, fetching up a Beseiju who endures into his hand. Then Rabblemaster triggers, creating another Goblin. Mike attacks Nick with the Goblin Rabblemaster, Ornithopter, Rograk, and 2 Goblins. Rabblemaster triggers and Winota triggers 5 times. Mike looks at the top 6 and puts Glow Rider onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ashani. Mike looks at the next 6 and fails to find. He looks at the next 6, putting Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ashani as well. He looks at the next 6, putting Professional Facebreaker onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Peter. He looks at the final 6, putting Cathar Commando onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ashani. Then Rabblemaster gets +2/+L. Ashani blocks with Dualcaster Mage, and Nick blocks a Goblin with Ranger Captain, and then they take the rest. Facebreaker triggers, and Mike creates 3 treasures. In his second main phase, Mike activates Cathar Commando, sacrificing it, destroying Wishclaw Talisman. With nothing else, Mike ships the turn. Ashani draws, casts a Mana Crypt, and passes to Nick. Nick draws and taps his Brushland to help cast his commander, Jetmir, Nexus of Rebels. He casts Teolani Summoner. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Ragavan and Ashani with Ranger Captain. They both take it, Ragavan triggers, and Mike exiles Ranger Captain of Eos, and Nick creates a treasure. In his second main phase, he activates Weathered Wayfarer and fetches up a Taiga into his hand. Nick plays a Taiga and passes the turn to Peter. Peter draws and pays 4 life to cast Balthor the Defiled. Kirik triggers and gets a counter. He ends the turn. During his upkeep, Mike loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. Rabblemaster triggers, creating a Goblin. He attacks Nick with Glow Rider and Ashani with 2 Goblins, Facebreaker, Ornithopter, Rograk, Thalia, and Goblin Rabblemaster. Rabblemaster triggers and Winota triggers 5 times. Mike looks at the top 6 and puts Mogcatcher onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ashani. He looks at the next 6 and puts Zealous Conscripts onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Peter. Conscripts triggers and Mike gains control of Jetmir. Mike looks at the next 6 and fails to find. He looks at another 6 and puts Sanctum Prelate onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ashani. As it enters, Mike names 2. Mike looks at the top 6 one last time, putting Myrel, Shield of Argive, onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Peter. Then Rabblemaster gets +2/+0. They all take it, and both Ashani and Peter die. Facebreaker triggers, creating 6 treasures. In his second main phase, Mike activates Facebreaker and exiles Ethersworn Canonist off of the top of his library. He activates Facebreaker again and exiles Combat Celebrant. He activates Facebreaker and exiles Giver of Runes. He does it one more time and exiles Flooded Strand. He plays a Flooded Strand from exile. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield. Mike casts Combat Celebrant from exile. He casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Ranger Captain of Eos. It's exiled and Nick gains 3 life. Mike casts Ethersworn Canonist. With nothing else, he passes the turn. Nick draws and plays a Beseiju, who endures as his land for turn. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with everything. Teolani triggers and Nick pays 10 mana into its ability, creating 9 elementals, tapped and attacking Mike. Teolani triggers and Nick gets the city's blessing. Unfortunately, Mike left his shields down, and since now the elementals have +3/+0, Vigilance, Trample, and Double Strike, Mike takes it all, dies, and Nick wins the game. Mike had the best Winota altar and gets to start us off. Mike draws a card for turn and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Human as it enters. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Professional Facebreaker. He passes. Lua draws a card for turn and plays a Plains. She casts a Jeweled Lotus. She casts a Selfless Savior. Lua passes. Rachel draws and plays a Plains. She casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Remorseful Cleric. She casts a Soul Ring. She casts a Mana Vault. In response, Mike reveals the Thorn of Amethyst he obviously should have cast turn 1, and everyone laughs. Rachel exiles Simeon Spirit Guide from her hand and adds a red. She casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and she creates 2 treasures. She casts her commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. Rachel ends her turn. Ian draws and reveal what he drew, which was a Gemstone Caverns, and dies a little bit inside. He plays a Flooded Strand for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield. He casts Serra Ascendant. Ian ships the turn to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ian with Facebreaker. Ian takes it, Facebreaker triggers, and Mike creates a treasure. All through, Mike ends his turn. Lua draws and plays a command tower. She cracks her Jeweled Lotus to help cast her commander, Winota, joiner of forces. She casts a Torch Courier. She moves to combat and attacks Mike with Selfless Savior and Torch Courier. Winota triggers twice. She looks at the top 6 and puts Rionia, Fire Dancer, onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Rachel. She looks at the next 6 and puts Esper Sentinel onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Rachel as well. Rachel blocks Rionia with Winota and Esper with Dockside, and Mike takes the hit. All finished up, Lua passes to Rachel. During her draw step, Rachel takes a damage from her Mana Vault. In her main phase, she casts Alseid of Life's Bounty. She moves to combat and attacks Mike with Dockside. Winota triggers, Rachel looks at the top 6 and fails to find. Then Mike takes it, and Rachel passes to Ian. Ian draws and plays a Needle Verge Pathway. He passes. At the end of Ian's turn, Mike flashes in an Aven Mind Sensor. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast his commander, Winota, joiner of forces. He moves to combat and attacks Lua with Facebreaker and Rachel with Mind Sensor. Winota triggers, Mike looks at the top 6 and puts Glow Rider onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Rachel. Both take it, Facebreaker triggers, and Mike creates 2 treasures. All through, Mike gives the turn to Lua. Lua draws and plays a Plains. She exiles Simeon's Spirit Guide from her hand, adding a red. She casts Rick, Steadfast Leader. In response, Ian yells,
Coral!
Yeah.
Coral!
Rick enters, and Lua chooses Lifelink and Vigilance. She moves to combat, Rionia triggers, and Lua creates a copy of Torch Courier. She attacks Mike with Selfless Savior, both Torch Couriers, and Winota. Winota triggers 3 times. She looks at the top 6 and puts Angrath's Marauders onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ian. She looks at the next 6 and puts Blade Historian onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Rachel. She looks at the next 6 and puts an Ethersworn Canonist onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Rachel as well. Before blocks, Ian flashes in an Archivist of Ogma. Then Mike blocks Winota with Winota, and Ian blocks Angrath's Marauders with his Archivist. Then they all take it, and Lua gains 56 life. Finished up and in a commanding position, Lua passes to Rachel. During her draw step, Rachel takes a damage from her Mana Vault. In her main phase, she casts Goblin Cratermaker. She moves to combat and attacks Mike with Dockside and Alseid of Life's Bounty. Winota triggers twice. She looks at the top 6 and puts Glow Rider onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Mike. She looks at the next 6 and puts a Seasoned Pyromancer onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Mike as well. Pyromancer enters, and Rachel discards City of Traders and draws 2. Mike then declares no blocks, takes the damage, and Rachel gains a life. Rachel ends her turn. Ian draws and plays a Blink Moth Nexus. He moves to combat and attacks Lua with Serra Ascendant to send a message. Lua takes it, and Ian gains 6. In his second main phase, Ian casts Drannith Magistrate. Ian ships the turn to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and activates Facebreaker, sacrificing a treasure, exiling Archivist of Ogma off of the top of his library. He plays a Gemstone Caverns for turn. He casts Combat Celebrant. He moves to combat and attacks Lua with Aven Mind Sensor to also send a message. Lua takes it, and all through, Mike passes the turn. Everyone sees the writing on the wall and concedes to Lua, despite her wanting to kill them fair and square. And Lua gets to start us off. Lua draws and plays an Arid Mesa. She casts a Jeweled Lotus. She cracks Arid Mesa, pays a life, and fetches up a Sacred Foundry onto the battlefield, untapped, paying 2 life. She casts a Soul Ring and passes to Rachel. Rachel draws and plays a Blink Moth Nexus. She casts a Soul Ring. She casts a Gold Mirror. Rachel ends her turn. Ian draws and plays a Sekenzan, Crucible of Defiance. He casts a Mana Vault. Ian passes. Mike draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts Mother of Runes. Mike ships the turn to Lua. Lua draws and casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and she creates 3 treasures. She cracks her Jeweled Lotus to help cast her commander, Winota, joiner of forces. Lua gives the turn to Rachel. During her upkeep, Rachel casts Enlightened Tutor, fetching up a Lotus Petal onto the top of her library. She draws and plays an Ink Moth Nexus for turn. She casts Lotus Petal and ends her turn. Ian draws and casts his own Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and in response, everyone tells Lua to crack her treasures. She refuses, and Ian creates 6 treasures. He cracks treasures to help cast his commander, Winota, joiner of forces. He cracks more treasures to cast Goblin Rabblemaster. He moves to combat, Rabblemaster triggers, and Ian creates a 1/1 Goblin with haste. He attacks Rachel with his Goblin. Winota triggers, Ian looks at the top 6 and puts Professional Facebreaker onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Mike. Both take it, Facebreaker triggers, and Ian creates 2 treasures. In his second main phase, Ian casts Serra Ascendant. Ian passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Sekenzan, Crucible of Defiance. He casts Deafening Silence. Mike ends his turn. Lua draws and casts Mogcatcher. She moves to combat, attacking Rachel with Dockside. Winota triggers, Lua looks at the top 6, putting Mother of Runes onto the battlefield tapped and attacking Mike. Both take it, and Lua gives the turn to Rachel. Rachel draws and casts her commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. She activates Blinkmoth Nexus, turning it into a creature. She moves to combat and attacks Lua with Blinkmoth. Winota triggers, Rachel looks at the top 6, putting Magus of the Moon onto the battlefield tapped and attacking Mike. They both take it, and Rachel ships the turn to Ian. Ian draws and moves to combat. Rabblemaster triggers, and Ian creates a goblin. He attacks Mike with Rabblemaster, Dockside, and 2 goblins, Rachel with Facebreaker, and Lua with Sarah Ascendant. Rabblemaster triggers and gets +3/+0. Winota triggers 4 times. He looks at the top 6 and fails to find. He looks at the next 6 and fails to find again. He looks at the next 6 and puts a Ranger Captain of Eos onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Lua. It enters, and Ian fetches up a Signal Pest into his hand. Then he looks at the next 6 and fails to find. Mike blocks a Goblin with Mother of Runes, and Lua blocks Ranger Captain with Winota. Before damage, Mike activates Mother of Runes, giving itself protection from red until the end of turn. Then they all take the rest, Ian gains 6, and Facebreaker triggers. Ian creates 3 treasures. In his second main phase, Ian casts Signal Pest. He casts a Mog Catcher. Ian passes. Mike draws, reveals what he drew, which is a Blade Historian, does nothing else, and passes. Lua draws and plays a Plains. She activates Mog Catcher, fetching up a Goblin Cratermaker onto the battlefield. She sacrifices Cratermaker, killing Ian's Mog Catcher. She moves to combat, attacking Mike with Dockside. Winota triggers, she looks at the top 6, putting Gold Knight Commander onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Mike. Mike takes it, and Lua ends the turn. Rachel draws and plays a Mana Confluence. She casts Eidolon of Rhetoric. Rachel passes. Ian draws and moves to combat. Rabblemaster triggers, and he creates a Goblin with Haste. He attacks Lua with 2 goblins, Sarah Ascendant, and Signal Pest, and attacks Mike with Dockside and Rabblemaster. Rabblemaster triggers and gets +3/+0. Signal Pest triggers, and his other attacking creatures get +1/+0. Winota triggers 5 times. He looks at the top 6 and fails to find. He looks at the next 6 and puts Mother of Runes onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Lua. He looks at the next 6 and puts Loyal Apprentice onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Lua as well. He looks at the next 6 and puts Combat Celebrant onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Lua. He looks at the next 6 one last time and fails to find. Mike blocks Rabblemaster with Mother of Runes. Before damage, Mike activates Mother of Runes, giving itself protection from red until the end of turn. Then they all take it, Facebreaker triggers, and Ian creates 2 treasures. In his second main phase, he casts Recruiter of the Guard. It enters, and he fetches up a Solitude into his hand. Finished up, Ian passes to Mike. Mike draws, takes no game actions, and passes. Lua draws and activates Mog Catcher. She fetches up Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker onto the battlefield. Gold Knight Commander triggers, giving her creatures +1/+1 until the end of turn. She activates Kiki-Jiki, targeting her Dockside. In response, Ian evokes Solitude, exiling a white card targeting Dockside. In response, Lua activates Mother of Runes, giving Dockside protection from white until the end of turn. Solitude's ability fizzles, then Ian sacrifices Solitude. Then Lua creates a copy of Dockside through Kiki-Jiki and creates 7 treasures. Gold Knight triggers and gives her creatures +1/+1. She moves to combat and attacks Ian with Dockside and Mike with a token copy of Dockside. Winota triggers twice. She looks at the top 6 and puts Blade Historian onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Rachel. Gold Knight triggers and gives her creatures +1/+1. She looks at the next 6 and puts Zealous Conscripts onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Rachel as well. Gold Knight triggers and her creatures get +1/+1. Zealous Conscripts triggers and she targets her own Kiki-Jiki. Still in combat, she activates Kiki-Jiki, creating a copy of Zealous Conscripts, untapping Kiki as it enters. With each iteration, Gold Knight Commander triggers, making her creatures infinitely large. With the final copy of Zealous Conscripts, she targets Ian's Professional Facebreaker, gaining control of it and untapping it. This now leaves Ian with no ability to block Lua's pro-white Dockside. Mike blocks a Goblin with Mother of Runes, and Rachel chump blocks with Eidolon and Magus of the Moon. Before damage, Mike activates Mother of Runes, giving itself pro-red until the end of turn. Then damage happens, and Ian dies. In her second main phase, Lua casts Remorseful Cleric. She casts Goblin Matron. It enters, and Lua fetches up Goblin Rabblemaster into her hand. She casts Goblin Rabblemaster. All finished up, Lua passes, sacrificing all of the token copies. Rachel draws and activates Inkmoth and Blinkmoth, making them into creatures until the end of turn. She moves to combat and attacks Mike with Gold Mirror and attacks Lua with Inky and Blinky. Winota triggers 3 times. She looks at the top 6, putting Adeline, Resplendent Cathar onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Lua. She looks at the next 6, putting Rionia, Fire Dancer onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Lua as well. She looks at the next 6, failing to find. Lua blocks Blinkmoth with Remorseful Cleric and Adeline with Goblin Matron. Then they take the rest. In her second main phase, Rachel casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. Rachel gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and rejoices that he finally drew a castable spell. He casts a Signal Pest and passes the turn. The table accepts that they have no answer to Lua's Kiki Zealous combo, concede, and Lua wins the game.